Hello, and welcome to Amazon Web Services Virtual Private Cloud Setup Overview. I want to personally thank you for joining. I'm Joe Holbrook, consulting architect as well as a technical trainer for several organizations as well. Uh, I'm based out of Jacksonville, Florida. I'm with Cloudburst Corp, a partner in Jacksonville, Florida. So for today, let's go ahead and start talking about what a virtual private cloud is. Now, Amazon has a pretty solid offering called virtual private cloud. And again, this is a very solid capability for the right customer use case. So we'll go in and talk about that. But essentially, a VPC is essentially a way to provision a private, isolated section of the AWS cloud and allows the customer to essentially extend their corporate network to AWS. So essentially, some hybrid cloud enablement as well. So let's go ahead and talk about some use cases as well as connection approaches. Now, when we talk about connection approaches, basically how are you going to connect your corporate network to the AWS cloud? And there's several different ways to do it. And again, this is all sort of like the technology answer that anyone is going to give. It depends, so what is the best approach? So we'll talk more about that. Network terms related to VPC. We'll then talk about workflows, how to create a VPC. And then lastly, I'll dive into the console and show you how to create a software VPN VPC. So let's define VPC first. So according to Amazon, it is a customizable, logically isolated section of AWS's cloud. And so you as the customer, you're essentially enabled to be able to go in from your customer network and connect to the AWS cloud. And I'm going to go into some of the terminology here, but for those folks that are not familiar with regions and availability zones, we'll get deeper into that. But again, let's just focus on what a VPC is first. So remember, a VPC is essentially a way for you to, provision a private area of your AWS cloud. And the benefit, though, for you as a customer is to be able to go out there and create a virtual network and therefore create your own private IP allocation, essentially, provision the network in a manner that is private. So this is a huge benefit. So when we talk about use cases, we'll get into that more. So let's talk about some of the components, because one of the things that I have traditionally found is around terminology with Amazon. A lot of folks do get confused with the terminology at first. So essentially, with AWS, you have a region. And a region is nothing more than essentially a geography. So is it, North America? Is it South America? Is it Asia? Is it Europe? That's essentially the region. But the region is also broken down into availability zones. And so let's say if you're here in the United States and you're using Northern Virginia, essentially, and so you're logged into AWS in North America and you're using essentially Northern Virginia. Well, that essentially is an availability zone that you could use. But let's say, for example, you're not comfortable using Northern Virginia for whatever reason, without having redundancy, let's say. you go ahead and go select another zone in the region, which is essentially North America for AWS. So let's say you want to use California, or you want to go use Central. That's up to you on how you want to configure that. Um, so do understand the main differences, and Amazon does a real good job at defining them as well. Now, a couple other things I did want to point out is you'll see that you'll have a route table here. And so a route table is necessary to create when you create a VPC. And if you think about it, again, how are you going to route between your internal network and also more than likely the external network to the internet as well. So we'll go ahead and talk more about that. So let's talk about some use cases quickly as far as what I typically see customers use for VPC. One of the more routine reasons that I see customers use a VPC for is for disaster recovery. Now, let's say you're a mid-sized company or a smaller company. Let's say you have under, a couple hundred employees. There's a very good chance that you don't have a disaster recovery site. And so that again could be a huge risk to your organization, to your business. And so what happens if you have a power grid issue? Or what happens if there's a tornado that hits in your area? What about if there's a flood? Or what about if, or for, as with just what happened with not just Amazon but other service providers, there could be DNS outages, and there could be other issues around people making mistakes, or even hacking issues. Who knows? So again, without a proper DR scenario planned for your specific business, it's important to plan ahead. And so customers that do use Amazon for DR typically would set up a VPC. And again, it's very simple to do. It could be more complex as well, depending on what you're doing. But for most cases, this may not be something that needs to take too much time and planning. Again, it's all depends, as I like to say. So DR is a really good use case. So for example, let's say you want to test out, how your instances will come up in the cloud, and so you go ahead and use Amazon to be able to do that, to spin up those instances and run those apps. Public-facing websites. So, a good use case is to have a public-facing website where you as a customer may want to have some kind of commercial website for social media, e-commerce, whatever it is. Could also be to extend the corporate network. So let's say, for example, your current data center footprint does not allow you to be able to add resources easily. Had a customer in New York City not too far ago. One of the challenges they had in Manhattan was trying to get space, trying to get power. In Manhattan, you just don't go call the electric company and they come out the next day or week to install additional circuits. It just doesn't happen like that. So what you need to do is think about, am I able to scale in-house? And if I can, I have to extend that corporate network. Hybrid cloud. So a hybrid cloud gives the benefits of a private cloud internally. Let's say you have a VMware vCloud and you want to extend it to the public cloud. This is a beautiful way to do it. Very inexpensive, very simple. It's been done thousands of times. Again, works pretty seamlessly in most use cases. So good opportunity for a customer that may not want to or can't, for whatever reason, invest in the proper infrastructure for a remote site or additional services or capabilities. Application scaling. Now, one of the areas that I see sort of coming up more and more is actually around application scaling. So let's say, for example, you're you're an organization that does a fair number of what I would call data collection exercises. So let's say you're using Hadoop in-house, or you're using um, a data warehouse, whatever you may be using. So it could be a popular data warehouse, it could be an Oracle database, it could be Hadoop. Let's say for your big data clusters, whatever you're doing, and and you don't really have the resources to scale that specific app in-house. You could also do that as well in the cloud. So for example, one of the areas that I see quite a bit of is customers like to use Amazon EC2 for scaling up their desktops or scaling up resources like at the end of the quarter, or performing testing, validating additional services as well. What are some of the benefits of a virtual private cloud? So it enables the company to be able to go out there and create a hybrid cloud approach fairly seamlessly. So essentially being able to create a solution that the customer can benefit from immediately with a very low requirement for CapEx, for example, allows the customer to take advantage of cloud scale. Now, we all know that trying to go get a rack of blade servers and additional storage arrays and network equipment can be a challenge, and the procurement process can take quite a while. So essentially, trying to meet some of your requirements can be a challenge when you have to go out and procure them yourselves. Also, too, you may not have the right expertise in house. For example, getting a good cloud architect or administrators is not an easy task. And again, a lot of that depends on the organization and how well they attract talent as well, I think, because again, there's great talent out there, but a lot of the problems come in, and with companies not willing to pay the going rate, as I like to say. Now, when it comes to traffic, one of the things that a VPC can definitely help with is around the ability to control traffic inbound and outbound. So, for example, let's say there's specific database services that should only run internally inside of your virtual private cloud. You don't want those services open to the internet. So again, it gives you great control and granularity if you so choose. Many different connection strategies. I've got a slide. We'll talk about that in detail. Provisioning of a VPC is rapid. Absolutely. When we do the demo, you'll see that to provision the services is not very time consuming, at least on the software VPN approach. Now, if you go with the direct connect, then there's a lag to do that because you're going to have a dedicated connection. You've got your service provider to work with. You've got Amazon endpoints to deal with. So again, those are some things to think about. So again, that's just one area to think of. Also, too, a lot of organizations are very comfortable with IPv4 and still use IPv4. However, Amazon VPCs do support IPv6 as well. And just one thing to note about that is you're going to be creating essentially the VPC with IPv4, but essentially you would associate an IPv6 address schema with that VPC configuration. So what is the workflow of a VPC? Now the workflow essentially is you're going to, in this case, the workflow we're going to do today is we're going to create a VPC with the wizard. Now this is the most simplest and fastest way to do it. However, the VPC interface as well, not just the wizard, is actually very simple as well. What I do like about the wizard is if you're just going to set up a short-term connection, with specifically a software-based VPN, then this is by far the most easiest approach, and it pretty much does everything you need anyways. So this is, again, the most common scenario that I would see, especially if you just want to run a DR test or you want to, run batch files or something quickly and then get out. Now, the next thing we want to talk about is address ranges, networking, NAT. We'll also talk about security groups and ACLs as well. We'll talk about whitelisting and blacklisting as well. And then finally, you'll want to add the EC2 instance as well. Some of the network terms, I won't spend a lot of time defining, I should say, network terminology that I'm sure most of you may already be aware of. But for those that may not have had deep network experience, some of these may very well be new. So again, one of the things that I do see in cloud computing quite a bit is that it melds a lot of expertise together. And so in a large corporation or even a mid-tier environment, you used to have real specialties. If you're the network guy, you're the network guy. If you were the application guru, you were the application guru. When we go to the cloud, it seems like all these specializations are slowly disappearing almost, or just not as evident as they used to be. So I did want to make sure we knew some of the network terms. So subnet, again, when we talk about subnet, let's talk about it from Amazon's point of view. So with Amazon's point of view, it's essentially a range of IPs that you're going to create in the AWS VPC that you're setting up. Now, do you know that you could create a private subnet or public subnet? Private subnet, this is going to be routed only in your VPC scenario. It could be that specific VPC, or it could also be a peered approach, which we'll touch on briefly, but for time purposes, we won't touch on too much. Or public, where you're going to route outside of the VPC. Internet gateway. Now, this is essentially a component that you're going to allow internet traffic between you and your private instances in EC2. So it's going to essentially use NAT protocol. And NAT, just to define NAT, because again, this is a term that people may or may not be familiar with, is a way for you to provision your network addresses essentially in a manner to where you're essentially defining a private subnet, and that private subnet can access the internet. That is typically done with port 4500, in case anybody is wondering. Routing table. So when we talk about routing tables, this is a rule set essentially. How is that traffic going to be, delivered, or how is it actually going to be forwarded on the network? VPC peering. So this is where you could peer up or connect to other virtual private clouds in Amazon. This is a really cool feature because, again, with VPC peering, it allows you to, instead of having to create additional um, uh, you know, connections between your corporate network and Amazon, essentially, you could just basically bypass that and pair your VPCs together. So let's say you had development instances and you had production. You don't want them to be in the same VPC, but you want them to be able to communicate with each other. This is a great way to be able to do that and not have to create um, additional VPNs or additional services between your corporate network and Amazon. IPsec, that is. This is again a protocol suite that you're going to be probably very familiar with if you are using Amazon. It's an approach to authentication, essentially. So what are the typical connection approaches? Now, for today, we're going to be mainly focused on the software VPN approach. However, again, hardware VPN is more than valid. Um, Software to hardware, this is where, for example, you may want to connect up between one region to another region. And the only way to do that is you'll have to use a software to hardware approach. AWS Direct Connect. Now, this is a spectacular feature or solution for a company that wants to have a dedicated connection, wants to have true privacy in the sense of instead of you just going over the internet and using a VPN, you could use Direct Connect, where you're going to be provisioned by your service provider a dedicated link. And again, Amazon supports that, beautifully in the sense that you would essentially set up a VPC, from your corporate network to the VPC, and you could leverage Direct Connect essentially to do that. And again, you would go through essentially the service provider, but you would actually be connecting up to dedicated hardware at AWS, and they're essentially routers that you would connect up that are essentially managed by you. So pretty great capability. Of course, there is a cost to that capability. And then VPC peering as well. We briefly touched on that as well. Now I put the link here because it's very important that you spend a few minutes to understand the way you could connect up. In most cases, if you're looking to do a DR test, or you don't need some of the additional um, additional solutions to help enable you to reduce issues like latency and increase privacy, then that's your call from a corporate perspective. Now, some of the thresholds that I think are important to note is you can only scale up to 5 VPCs per region. Now, of course, there's always variations to a lot of these limits. You may have to contact Amazon to get a higher limit. They'll typically look at this on a case-by-case basis. 200 subnets per VPC, 200 route tables, 500 security groups, and 50 inbound, outbound rule sets as well. And again, do take a look at the link there. So let's go ahead and get to the console, and we'll go ahead and configure a VPC. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm currently logged into the AWS console. I'm going to go ahead and go over to Virtual Private Cloud, and that's under the Networking and Content Delivery subsection. And you can see right now that I have 3 virtual private clouds set up right here. I'm going to go ahead and just confirm what region I'm in. I'm going to go ahead and leave it as Northern Virginia. And if I go over here to, actually if I select your VPCs, you could see that there's 3 available. Now, just so that you're aware, the default max limit is 5 VPCs per zone. So just be aware of that as well. Now, as far as subnets, routing tables, internet gateways, and security groups, I already pre-configured those for the demo. So let's go ahead and create a security group. Now, for this purpose, we're going to go ahead and go back to the dashboard. I'm going to go ahead and just select the wizard. And you can see that the VPC is giving me 4 different options here. I'm going to go with the first option in this case. We're just going to create a single public-facing website in this case, so I don't need to have a significant number of private subnets in this case. We're just going to do this for testing purposes only. So I'm going to go ahead and leave the seeder block the same. I'm going to go ahead and call this AWS Demo VPC. And I'm going to go ahead and put in the region of Northern Virginia. I'm going to call this number 2, actually, because I already created number 1. The subnet, again, I'm going to leave this as a class B, so leave that the way it is. I'm going to leave the availability zone as no preference, so it'll automatically select the first available one. However, I could select whatever one I so choose. The hardware tenancy, this is something you want to leave as default in this case, but if you wanted to have a dedicated instance of the VPC, you could also do that. So it is, go ahead, it's creating the network, as you can see. Now it says it's been created. And the next thing I'm going to need to do is I'm going to have to create an instance and essentially tie that in the VPC. So let's go ahead and go to the dashboard. I'm going to go ahead and use a shortcut that I have to EC2. You could see that there's 3 running instances. So let's go ahead and kick this off. I'm going to go with the default of the image right there with Amazon Linux. As you can see, I'm using the free tier, so I'm pretty limited in my choices. And then I'm going to also go and confirm that this is the configuration I need. And one thing I did need to note is that you can see that it is open to the world. And lastly, it defaults to SSH access port 22. In this case, I want to edit that security group. I left that open just because I wanted to just give you a quick demo with this. I'm going to leave it as HTTP port 80. That way I could get to the web traffic. And you could see I could go ahead and launch it. Now, you also need to understand that you need to have a PEM file that is going to be your keys, essentially. I'm going to leave it as the key demo that I already set up for time purposes and simplicity. And let's go back and just double check that this VPC is up and running. I should have 4. As you can see, there is 4 VPCs.